Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. Manly Palmer Hall was a master teacher of Hermetic mysteries, a metaphysical scholar, and collector of all things mystical. He lived in Los Angeles and gave lectures every Sunday at his mystery school, which was known as the Philosophical Research Society. He was the author of The Secret Teaching of All Ages, among many other books. Our guest today found him to be an inspiring esoteric thinker, but also as a genuinely kind human being who simply wanted to share his quest for inner meaning and rare wisdom with the world. And she had the great good fortune to work with him for 7 years. Our guest today is Tamra Lucid, author of the new book, Making the Ordinary Extraordinary, My 7 Years in Occult Los Angeles with Manly Palmer Hall. Tamra is a founding member of the experimental rock band Lucid Nation. She was a writer and editor for Newtopia magazine and the principal interviewer for the original Reality Sandwich. She has produced documentary films including Exile Nation, The Plastic People, End of the Line, The Women of Standing Rock, and the award-winning Viva Cuba Libre, Rap is War. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband, Ronnie Pontiac. Hello, Tamra, and welcome to the Pathways Show.
Hi, Paul. Nice to be here.
Now, for the sake of many in our audience, let's start by asking you, who exactly was Manly P. Hall?
He was what I have now learned to describe as an actual philosopher. He was absolutely fascinated by all things mystical, esoteric, occult, but mostly philosophical. He was an incredible book collector. He fancied all things antiquarian books. And somehow he managed, during the Great Depression, and a little bit before that, to become someone who had patrons who allowed him to just develop that skill of being an antiquarian book collector, a fine art collector, and a philosopher. And he started very small, speaking to small groups, basically about what he had been studying for many years already, while he was a young man. And then it just carried through to, he opened up the PRS, Philosophical Research Society. And for about 60, 70 years, gave lectures every Sunday and shared the wisdom that he loved reading about and sharing with other people, helping other people. He found that the best way to help other people, he wanted to be of service, of course, to people. And he found the best way to be of service to humanity was through his own studies to synthesize, translate, and share what he had learned through these studies.
It's kind of amazing to think about a philosopher who had patrons in the 20th century. That's such an awesome concept. There's not a whole lot of examples of that, I don't think.
Yeah, this had always, since Egypt, they would give the priests of the Temple of Bast, the priestesses of the Temple of Bast, well, they would give them things to sustain their activities, that it was a mutual benefit. They did the spiritual work, and the bread makers were over there, and everybody did their part. But there was a spiritual aspect to human life that was a necessity, and that is kind of become more upon the individual these days. There are no mystery schools.
Right.
There are no places where people, well, I'm going to this Catholic school because I'm going to learn the mysteries of Catholicism.
Right.
Catholicism doesn't work that way, really. You have to be in the priesthood.
even then, I
Right.
don't think they learned the mysteries.
Yeah, it was a little iffy.
Well, is there, it seems like, I mean, he was born around 1900 or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And that was like shortly after there was this resurgence of kind of mystical Christianity in America. There was Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists. There was a kind of a, and there, what was her name? Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. So I'm sure he must have been influenced by some of that stuff.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. In the small lecture room where a lot of times that's where Ronnie would give lectures. There were study groups that went up there and stuff. It was a small lecture room. And there was a big portrait of Helena Blavatsky sitting there with her finger to her temple, looking intense, the way only Blavatsky could. But he loved Madame Blavatsky. He loved reading her stuff. He loved, figuring out what exactly she meant, because that's a problem with some of these more earlier texts and stuff. It's like with alchemy, there was the language. It's so difficult to translate a mystical experience. Think of trying to explain a mystical experience to someone,
Right.
especially a skeptic. It's very tough. And now these people were trying with even more limited language to explain something that's really tough to explain. So first of all, having someone like Mr. Hall saying, we think that maybe this is what the author was trying to express, but only through a limited capacity. Also, describing mystical experiences, having mystical experiences was definitely something that got the attention of the church, and it wasn't the good kind of attention.
Right.
So it got a lot of people burned. A lot of books are burned.
Literally
So,
burned. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll burn you.
Yeah. I remember, well, when I was like around 20 years old, I became fascinated by the Theosophical Society and I joined it. And in fact, I went to India and stayed at the Ledbetter. I stayed at the Theosophical Society headquarters in Adyar. In the
That's fascinating.
It was fascinating. I loved it, where they discovered Krishnamurti and, oh my God, and I guess there must have been a real hunger, and there still is a real hunger for these kind of experiential mystical teachings, because like in Mr. Hall's case, he really became quite a star, as you point out in your book. He gave a lecture a couple times at Carnegie Hall and set an attendance record.
Yeah. Well, he and Krishnamurti were friends. They were pals.
Is that right? Oh,
yes.
That's
amazing. Yeah, they hung out with each other, talk sports.
Wow.
I'm thinking maybe something, other things may have come up. They told jokes to each other, compared notes, I suppose. But I do mention in the book, it's like, wow, that's an unfortunately not recorded couple of conversations there, because they could have been fabulous.
I'm sure they were. And when I lived in India, I worked for a very famous yoga teacher who was really good friends with Krishnamurti in the 20s. So I heard a lot of things, and I read his books, and I swear, to read him is sort of like, it's like meditation in and of itself. It's sort of like,
oh yeah.
He describes the view from the top of the mountain. And I didn't find it extremely helpful in terms of how to get up there, but it was inspiring as hell.
Yeah, it's a nice view that he described, huh?
Yeah, but I didn't know that he and Manly Hall were friends. Got it. Those would have been some great conversations. Yeah. Now, Manly Hall's 1942 lecture that set the attendance records at Carnegie Hall was entitled "The Secret Destiny of America."
Woohoo.
And I learned from Wikipedia that that was a kind of a theme that was adopted by Ronald Reagan many years later, the city on
Yeah,
the hill and all of that. But do you know anything about what his idea was about the destiny of America?
no.
Oh, fair enough.
um,
Well,
I think he would weave into it an elevated, spiritual, educated, conscious relationship to ourselves, to the external world, to each other. Basically, it's an enlightened consciousness for the entire country. That's what he would want.
well,
Enlightenment,
right. Well,
easily said.
he authored like 150 books
Yes,
and pamphlets, and he delivered around 7,000 lectures. So
yeah.
he had
He
a
liked
lot.
to work and he liked what he did, so it's no problem.
That's beautiful. He had a lot to share.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think I said I own one of his most famous books, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. I can't say I've read it cover to cover. It's an amazing coffee table book, that's for sure.
It is definitely
But
great doorstop, but it's this was literally him gathering all these, what he felt were all the things that every student of the occult and the mysteries goes after. So here it is in one handy, gigantic book. And, it's not something you could just easily tuck in the inside pocket of your jacket or put in the backpack, but it's a nice book to have. A lot of it is not the best sources in the world, but it was the constant sources that all people seem to go to. So having that in one condensed book, it sure made it a lot easier to study all these things so that you get the flavor, get the idea, understand why people were looking at this stuff at the time, and gather your information to make your own evaluation of what you need in your situation.
I read somewhere that he dedicated that book to, quote, the proposition that concealed within the emblematic figures, allegories, and rituals of the ancients is a secret doctrine concerning the inner mysteries of life, which doctrine has been preserved in toto among a small band of initiated minds. And how lucky were you, Tamra, to be privy to this kind of wisdom and this kind of knowledge working in the library of the Philosophical Research Society? It's amazing.
That was fun. Yeah, but this is the funny thing. It wasn't, hey, Tamra, this is what the Masons thought, and here's the handshake, freak somebody out next time you meet them. It wasn't like that. It was more likely, my favorite thing to do was to find some object of art or some, strange little theory or one of my favorite stories is Apollonius of Tyana. Well, it was said that he stopped a riot just by standing still. Now, most of us have seen riots and understand that riots are very energetic, and somebody standing still is more a target than somebody who's going to quell that violence. However, went out to dinner one night, and Mr. Hall demonstrated with an aggressive, angry man yelling at his wife and getting really hostile. Mr. Hall stepped in front of this woman and then so beautifully ignored this man as this man tried to get at the woman. So he deflected this man's anger. The man went after Mr. Hall and started screaming at him. Mr. Hall, being very, very tall and very, very placid in his demeanor, kept turning his head and not even engaging the man's screams. The man quickly wore himself out as if he collected himself and realized what he was doing and started apologizing and took his wife by the hand and quietly left, apologized to everyone, apologized to Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall never saw it, never acknowledged it, still kept looking the other way like he was going, that's a marvelous shrubbery over there. And so that question about Apollonius quelling a riot, well, symbolically speaking,
Right.
did we not see Mr. Hall quell a riot? The riot was that guy, and it was violent, and it was threatening, and it was ready to attack anything, anyone. And by simply being quiet and passive, non-reactive, he quelled the riot. So symbolically speaking, we got a very dramatic and a real lesson in how that can work. So, all right, lesson learned.
How old
that can't happen.
How old was he when you met him?
I guess so. His 80s.
In his 80s?
Yeah, he was 83, something like that.
Was he still handsome? I mean, I've seen pictures.
Oh yeah. Oh my God. Yes. Yeah. He had the
I've
most
seen pictures of him
beautiful
in his-
eyes.
Yeah, I mean, he looked like Krishnamurti. I mean, he was stunningly handsome in his 20s. That
Oh my God. Movie star handsome.
right. And how did you meet him?
We volunteered at PRS. I had all kinds of qualifications because I knew I'd worked in a bank and I knew business machines and typing and filing and all that kind of stuff. And they were like, oh yeah, we like volunteers like you. And Ronnie was sitting there, and Ronnie was the one that was really into the book. And they were like, well, what do you do? It's like, I don't know, read a lot. And they asked about language. And he said, well, I know some French, I know some German, I know some Russian. I can, I can't, speak it or read it per se, but if I have a dictionary, I can get through it quite fine. Yeah, I can do that.
Uh-huh.
And it was like, And so a couple days, they offered me a job straight away. And we were kind of like, I don't like business machines anyway. And that's not exactly what I wanted to do. I was kind of hesitant. He was kind of hesitant. And then we get a phone call, and it's for Ronnie. And it's like, can you come in and meet Mr. Hall? And he's like, yeah, sure. So when he met Mr. Hall, Mr. Hall just, the first thing he said to Ronnie was, sit down and make yourself miserable. So Ronnie sat down. Mr. Hall just handed him a galley for the alchemical bibliography he was working on. And Ronnie was like, I don't know anything about alchemy, and I don't know anything about bibliographies. And Mr. Hall was like, yeah, but you know some languages. You know what? I think you can do it. Go ahead.
Wow. Yeah.
When Ronnie walked out, of course, the vice president, Pat Irvin, said, okay, no, thank you. That was nice of you, but no. And took the galley away. And Ronnie was kind of relieved. It was like, that's not, yeah, you're right. But we got to meet him, and we were really thrilled about that.
Uh-huh.
That evening, we got a phone call, and it was Mr. Hall's secretary, Edith, and she said, Mr. Hall's office tomorrow, 9 a.m. See you, Ronnie. And the whole event happened again, except no one else was involved except the secretary, Edith, and Ronnie, and Mr. Hall. And Mr. Hall said, from now on, you only take orders and instructions from me. This is what you're going to do. You're going to work on this alchemical bibliography, and I will help you every step of the way and proofread all your work. Get busy. And so we had to go get Latin dictionaries and, all kinds of German, French, English dictionaries, English dictionaries. Yeah. Because you never know. And that's how it started.
That's what a strange story. What a strange.
Yeah.
You describe in the book how Manly Hall had a way with synchronicity, and
Yeah.
there's some kind of extrasensory perception of synchronicity.
I think it's openness to what the world offers you and how it speaks to you, what it says to you, where it guides you.
Mhm.
That's the that's the whole art of mysticism, isn't it? It's actually being open and sensitive to a higher elevation of thought,
Being in
higher
alignment.
consciousness.
Yeah, being in alignment.
Yes.
You describe it in the book, and I'm going to quote you. That's how it is when you're in harmony with the Tao. You can't tell the difference between the coincidental and the intentional.
Mhm.
You know, do you think we
That's true.
do you think we all have this capacity? Of course, he had it in spades, but do you think we all have that within us?
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's the sensitivity. It's a talent that has to be developed. And in the process of that, and self-help comes into that, a serious to seriously dedicate yourself to a mystical life, you have to be very serious in your personal responsibility, owning your personal stuff, self-awareness, self-reflection.
Right.
One of the things that's written under the statue that I like to emphasize, it's not the statement on the statue dedicated to true seekers of all times, know thyself. I think those 3 words are the most important thing. And always the greatest teacher, the greatest lessons. It's not understanding what Aleister Crowley was thinking, although he was a very funny dude. I don't try and understand what he was thinking. That poor guy was tormented. It's understanding yourself. Why are you so interested in what Crowley was thinking?
Right.
What is your motivation?
Do you think that your intuition was improved by hanging out around Manly Hall for 7 years? Because he must have had some faith in your intuition, or you would not have become what you call in your book his quote weirdo screener.
Yeah, I think it well, he taught me the fine art of falling back a little and listening.
Mm-hmm.
But
there were so many crazy people that were trying to get next to him.
Oh, I mean, yeah.
And that was,
it's also, they always talk about how initiates or mystical types, they can disappear. Well, you know what that is? That's just somebody who's non-intrusive, who knows how to just go Homer Simpson in the bushes,
right.
And you can do that in the middle of a huge crowd. You can do that when there's 2 people in the room. There's a way of pulling back and being receptive and observing. You're fishing, actually, aren't you? You have to be real quiet when you fish.
Now, you at some point, and I don't know whether this was after your working relationship with Manly Hall ended, but at some point you became a Riot Grrrl. And
Yeah.
I don't have any personal experience with the Riot Grrrls, although I understand it was an underground feminist punk movement. Did you come to think any differently about Manly Hall when you became a Riot Grrrl?
No.
Okay.
He's a wonderful man. Mm-hmm. Absolutely wonderful man.
Was there any kind of overlap? I mean, being a Riot Grrrl, that's kind of a rebellious thing, right? I mean, was there any kind of overlap of that personality dynamic within you and your affinity for Manly Hall in the first place?
Well, I went there to know thyself.
Right.
It had a kind of a custom fit for me because one of the things that I got out of watching mysticism was the ladies are treated pretty shabbily in this arena. And the patriarchal the bad patriarchal isms were just as alive and well there as they were in the context of when Riot Grrrls would get together and talk about the difficulty in, you know, equality and
Right.
you know, gender issues.
And
So
do you
go
think
ahead.
that your songwriting and music composition was informed by your exposure to mysticism
Yeah, definitely.
and your band Lucid Nation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that was a joke. That was a joke that came in a dream. And that was that Ronnie named the name of the band. It's Lucid Nation. It's a joke.
Uh-huh.
Now it was all informed by that, you know, that the whole, after coming out of the mystical, I had more, well, I felt like this particular scene afforded me an opportunity to express all that frustration and patriarchal oppression that I experienced in mysticism. And this was a psychological problem that I had gone through my whole life.
Right.
Now I have a chance to express it openly within the confines of a scene that want to hear about that. We were all talking about that.
Right.
So it was just like the world opened up and said, hey, why don't you try out working some of that stuff out here? You can do it in 2-minute funk songs.
Right. Right.
And, you know, it went from there because, you know, part of the reason I went from Riot Grrrl to a singer that would say, just play and I'll come up with something. It'll be freestyle.
Mm-hmm.
That was based on a story Mr. Hall told me about the bodhisattva that took the leap of faith.
Okay. Okay.
You know,
well,
it's not smart to say, just play anything and I'll come up with a song. Most people don't like to do that. Nobody had seen freestyle basically in the scenes I was hanging around with. But that's what that was based on. The bodhisattva leap of faith.
You know, I want to thank you for being on I want to thank you for being on our show. We're out of time and there's so much more we could explore, but we just don't have time. And I want our listeners to look you up and to look up your book. And I'll tell them about that in a minute. And I want to just say to our listeners, for those who may have tuned in to Pathways late, this is your host, Paul O'Brien. And don't worry, you can play or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or free podcast. Today, we've been visiting with Tamra Lucid, author of Making the Ordinary Extraordinary, My 7 Years in Occult Los Angeles with Manly Palmer Hall. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast and streamed on the internet at www.kboo.fm every other Sunday morning at 8:30 USA Pacific Time. And podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are available for free at divination.com. That's DIVI nation.com, as well as via iTunes, my YouTube channel, and other free podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Tamra Lucid and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.